UFC rankings are supposed to tell us who the best fighters in the world are, but somehow they end up making everything more confusing. They don't show momentum, they don't show danger, and they definitely don't show who's actually close to a title shot. So instead of arguing about the rankings today, I want to try something a little bit different. I want to remove them entirely and replace them with something that actually makes sense for the UFC. But before we talk about fixing anything, it's worth asking how we even got here in the first place. Because the UFC rankings didn't always feel this confusing, and understanding that history explains why they're breaking down now. Early UFC was simple, smaller rosters, frequent fights, and a fight anyone anywhere mentality meant rankings weren't that important. They were used more of a reference point than a roadmap, and if you were the best, you fought the best. Today the UFC is a global sports empire, bigger rosters, more divisions, massive marketing, and fewer fights at the top, but the ranking system hasn't evolved alongside it. It's still structured like the early UFC, designed for a smaller and simpler sport. That mismatch is the core problem. So before we talk about fixing anything, let's clarify what rankings are actually supposed to do. On paper, rankings are straightforward. They're meant to reward winning, show who's next, and give the division some structure. But in practice, they don't really do that. It often feels like things are happening behind the scenes that don't match what's happening in the cage. Matchups that make complete sense don't get made, and us fans never get an explanation why. Usually it's not down to a fighter's talent, it's marketing, timing, availability, all the stuff that sits outside of competition. What's funny is, if you ignore the rankings completely, most divisions actually tell a pretty clear story on their own. Who's hot, who's climbing, who's slowing down, that story just doesn't always match the rankings list. And that disconnect isn't accidental, it's structural, because MMA isn't a sport that fits neatly into numbers, and that's where the whole system starts to fall apart. So why do the current rankings fail? It's because rankings assume MMA is linear. They assume that if fighter A beats fighter B and fighter B beats fighter C, then fighter A must be better than fighter C. But anyone who actually watches the sport knows that MMA doesn't work like that. Styles clash, timing matters, confidence matters, injuries, short notice matchups, all of this matters. Rankings flatten all of that into a number, and then we act surprised when matchmaking feels wrong. There are a lot of reasons why the system fails, and this is where tiers starts to make things a lot clearer. But before we get there, it's important to understand how rankings actively hurt the sport. Rankings don't just fail to explain the sport, they actively protect certain parts of it. The reality is that rankings protect investments. Bigger names get longer breaks, safer timing, and more favourable paths back. Meanwhile, dangerous newcomers keep hearing the same thing: just one more win, or he hasn't fought anyone elite yet. Rankings act like a buffer zone around the elite. Lose once at the top and you're pretty cushioned. Lose once on the way up and you'll just reset, and fans feel that instinctively. That's why most fans don't actually trust the rankings anymore, and that's why fans stop taking rankings at face value. Not consciously, but instinctively, because most people watching already know when something doesn't add up. If you were to ask fans who deserves a title shot, they won't quote rankings. They'll talk about win streaks, momentum, and who beat who. Fans argue about rankings constantly, and that's the tell. If they were trusted, we wouldn't debate them this much. Fans already make their own rankings in real time. Social media has become the people's scoreboard, and an unofficial ranking no one believes is like a scoreboard no one watches. You can update it all you want. If it doesn't shape perception, it doesn't matter. But there's one more piece that really breaks the illusion, and it's something that should matter more than almost anything in a combat sport, and that's activity. Inactivity in the UFC is punished, unless it isn't. Some fighters sit out for a whole year and barely move. Other fighters fight twice, maybe 3 times, and barely budge. We've all heard Dana say, "We can't force anyone to fight." And while the public thrashing is an indirect to someone on the roster, it also tells others that inactivity can be used as a strategy. Activity becomes negotiable. It's like a participation trophy, but only if the UFC approves your participation. Fighters wait for the perfect matchup or the perfect payday, holding their ranking hostage in the process, while hungry prospects fight frequently, and go nowhere. And once again, the same pattern appears. The rankings don't stall contenders, they protect the top. And this is where MMA starts to feel completely out of step with every other major sport, because in most competitive systems, availability is part of performance. Look at the Premier League here in the UK. You win, you climb the table. You lose, you drop. You stop playing, the league moves on without you. The NBA and the NFL work the same way in the US. Positions change constantly based on performance and availability. Nobody sits near the top for a year without playing, and that mismatch is the real issue. So how do you fix it? Well, you stop pretending that static rankings are enough. Instead of asking where a fighter is ranked, I think the better question to ask is, how close are they to actually fighting for the belt? Because not every win moves you closer to a title, and not every loss means you're out of the picture. Contender tiers aren't about who's best on paper, they're about readiness, momentum, and realistic opportunity. Once you look at the division through that lens, everything else becomes much easier to understand. And once you shift the question from who's ranked where to how close someone really is, the structure almost builds itself. Forget ranking fighters 1 through 15. Instead, imagine every division broken into 3 colour-coded tiers: red, yellow and green. Not based on hype, not based on popularity, but based on where a fighter actually is in their competitive life cycle right now. Once you see the sport this way, a lot of modern UFC problems suddenly disappear. The red tier sits at the very top of the division. It includes only 2 fighters, both elite, both are ready to fight for the title right now. There's no more one more wins needed. There's no more depending on how this goes. If you're in the red tier, a title shot makes sense immediately. This alone fixes one of the biggest ranking problems. Too many so-called contenders and zero clarity. There should never be 4, 5, 6 next in line. There should be 1. Maybe 2. Now obviously not everyone is there yet, and this is where most real divisions actually live. Below that is the yellow tier. This consists of 4 fighters, proven, dangerous, high level competitors. These are fighters everyone can agree are good, but they're missing one thing: a recent elite win that forces that title conversation. Yellow tier fighters should fight against each other or fight someone from the red tier. Win and you move up, lose you drop a spot, lose twice in a row you drop a tier. No confusion, no politics, just results. And below that is where things can get messy. This is the tier rankings struggle with the most. The green tier is where rankings fall apart completely. This tier includes dangerous prospect, new UFC signings, fighters changing weight classes, former elites on the decline, and veterans who still can't walk away. This tier isn't weak at all, it's chaotic. Anyone here can break into yellow quickly. Anyone can derail a contender's run and completely change a division overnight. Rankings usually hide that danger, but tiers expose it. And when you put all of that together, something interesting happens. Matchmaking stops becoming confusing and it starts to become obvious. Title shots feel earned. Stakes are clearer immediately. Instead of asking why someone is ranked higher, you ask what tier they're in and who should they fight next in that tier. Every fight now has meaning to it. Green versus green builds future stars. Green versus yellow tests them stars. Yellow versus yellow decides contenders. Red versus yellow draws a line between contenders and the elites. And red versus red decides championships. And once every fight tells you something clear, you realise the problem was never the fighters, it was the system trying to explain them. Rankings try to simplify MMA, but they actually distort it. A tier system accepts the sport for what it really is: chaotic, stylistic, and constantly evolving. Once you stop obsessing over the numbers, the sport finally makes sense. If you've made it this far, genuinely, thanks for sticking with me. I appreciate it. Let me know what you think. Do tiers work better than rankings? And which fighters in the UFC currently would you put into red, yellow and green tiers? Thanks for watching.